Benjamin Franklin had entered the world in 1706 in the bustling colonial town of Boston, the 15th of 17 children born to Josiah Franklin, a struggling candle and soap maker. The household was always crowded and noisy, filled with the smell of tallow and boiling lye, and there was never enough money to go around. From an early age, Benjamin stood apart from his siblings, not for physical strength or charm, but for his insatiable curiosity. He scavenged for any scraps of printed material he could find, sermons, pamphlets, old almanacs, and read them by the dim light of a single candle late into the night. His father had intended for him to follow the family trade, but Benjamin's hands, more suited to holding a quill than stirring vats of hot wax, betrayed no enthusiasm for the work. When it became clear that schooling beyond the basics would be too costly, his formal education ended after only 2 years, yet his mind refused to rest. At 12, he was apprenticed to his older brother James, who had recently opened a small printing shop. The shop was a cramped room filled with the constant clatter of type, the smell of ink, and the rhythmic creak of the hand press. The work was tedious, demanding endless hours of setting tiny lead letters into frames, inking plates, and pulling heavy levers. Paper was scarce and expensive, and mistakes were punished with harsh words. Yet Franklin found a strange exhilaration in the routine. He watched the printed sheets emerge like magic from the press, words and ideas suddenly taking form in solid black lines. He memorized the layouts of columns, studied the curves of letters, and absorbed the mechanics of the press as though they were secrets to a hidden world. The apprenticeship was not only a training in craft, but also an education in resilience. James was a harsh and often impatient master, quick to scold and slow to praise. He ruled the shop with a heavy hand, and Benjamin, though naturally spirited, learned to conceal his pride behind silence and hard work. When James founded the New England Courant, one of the first independent newspapers in the colonies, Benjamin's responsibilities multiplied. He carried ink-stained bundles through the streets, gathered gossip from taverns, and swept the floor when the shop grew too cluttered. But in quiet moments, when the press was still and the candles burned low, he practiced writing essays of his own. He devoured the works of classical authors, moral philosophers, and English poets, imitating their style to sharpen his prose. Lacking mentors, he became his own teacher, marking his sentences for flaws and rewriting them until they pleased his exacting standards. He had little interest in childish games or idle chatter. His companions were books, and his greatest ambition was to master the power of language. The shop provided him access to a stream of printed matter, and he read everything: political tracts, scientific treatises, sermons, and satires, building a private library inside his mind. Eventually, his secret writing sought an outlet. Knowing James would dismiss his work if he presented it openly, Franklin adopted the persona of a fictional middle-aged widow named Silence Dogood. Under this disguise, he slipped essays beneath the shop door at night. They appeared in the Courant without James knowing their origin and quickly became popular among the paper's readers. They were witty, moralizing, and sharply observant, and they revealed a precocious intellect behind their playful tone. When James discovered the ruse, his reaction was not admiration, but anger, and the already strained relationship between the brothers began to crack. Tension poisoned the air of the shop. Arguments flared over trivial matters and often ended in shouting or blows. Benjamin felt stifled both by his brother's authority and by the narrowness of Boston's provincial world. He wanted more than the endless drudgery of apprenticeship and the small horizons it promised. The city that had nurtured his first steps into the life of the mind now felt like a prison. By 17, his patience had worn thin. In the autumn of 1723, without a word to most of his family, he slipped away from Boston aboard a coastal sloop bound for New York, hoping to find work as a printer. The voyage was rough, the sea winds sharp, and the little money he carried dwindled quickly. New York offered no employment, so he pressed on to Philadelphia, trudging the final miles on foot, his clothes rumpled and pockets nearly empty. When he finally arrived, tired, hungry, and soaked from rain, he cut a comical figure wandering the unfamiliar streets with a loaf of bread tucked under each arm. Yet beneath his ragged appearance burned a fierce determination. He had abandoned the security of home and defied the authority of his master, driven by a restless conviction that he was meant for more than anonymity. The skills he had forged in the noisy little shop in Boston, the discipline, the love of words, the stubborn persistence, were all he carried with him. But to Franklin, they were treasure enough. In that moment, though he stood alone and unknown in a strange city, the path of his life had quietly shifted. He was no longer merely a printer's apprentice. He had set himself on the long, uncertain road toward becoming Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin arrived in Philadelphia with nothing but a few coins in his pocket and an unyielding determination to carve out a place for himself in the bustling colonial city. The streets of Philadelphia were unfamiliar and harsh, yet they teemed with opportunities for those willing to seize them. Franklin began by taking any work he could find, delivering messages, setting type, and assisting in local print shops. He labored silently and diligently, often working long hours that stretched from the first light of dawn until the last flicker of candlelight at night. His hands became stained with ink and calloused from the relentless rhythm of the press. But he viewed each day as a step closer to the future he envisioned. The work was grueling, but he treated it as a form of apprenticeship, absorbing every technical detail of printing, distribution, and publication. Outside the shop, Franklin's nights belonged to his books. He spent what little money he had on second-hand volumes and borrowed whatever he could from acquaintances, often staying awake until the candles guttered out and the pages blurred before his eyes. He immersed himself in the writings of philosophers, scientists, and political thinkers, seeking not only knowledge but also the habits of disciplined thought that he believed were essential to success. While other young men his age sought entertainment and diversion, Franklin trained his mind to see the patterns in human affairs, the mechanics of trade, and the deeper questions of nature. He wrote constantly, filling scraps of paper with observations, arguments, and imagined essays, refining his language as he had once refined his typesetting. His relentless drive soon drew the notice of local merchants and craftsmen who admired his efficiency, reliability, and quiet intelligence. They began offering him small contracts and recommending his work to others. Franklin took each commission seriously, no matter how minor, ensuring that the quality exceeded expectations. This reputation for dependability became his foundation, and within a few years he had saved enough to open his own printing shop. The venture was modest at first, a cramped space with worn tools and a single press. But Franklin poured his energy into it. He personally oversaw every stage of production, from layout to binding, and sought out promising content that would appeal to readers hungry for news, commentary, and entertainment. His newspaper quickly became a fixture in the city. It stood apart from others not only because of its sharp typography and regular publication, but also because of Franklin's distinctive editorial voice. He wrote essays, satires, and practical advice under various pseudonyms, shaping public opinion while concealing his identity. The pieces blended wit with moral reflection, offering readers both amusement and instruction. People began to speak of the young printer whose words seemed to illuminate the concerns of everyday life with uncommon clarity. Advertisers flocked to his pages, and subscriptions steadily grew, transforming the once struggling shop into a thriving business. Franklin's ambitions did not stop at commercial success. As his income grew, he invested it back into the community, believing that personal prosperity meant little without public improvement. He organized a group of like-minded citizens to establish a lending library, giving ordinary people access to books they could not afford to buy. He played a key role in founding a debating club that later evolved into the American Philosophical Society, fostering intellectual exchange in a city that had long lacked it. These initiatives reflected his conviction that knowledge should be a shared resource, and they enhanced his reputation as a civic leader. At the same time, Franklin refined his public persona.
He cultivated the image of a disciplined, industrious, and frugal man, wearing plain clothes and maintaining a modest lifestyle, even as his wealth grew. This self-presentation resonated in a society that valued practical virtue over ostentation. Yet behind the simplicity lay a strategic mind, constantly seeking new ways to expand his influence. He studied the mechanics of trade and finance, experimented with new printing techniques, and explored opportunities in publishing almanacs, pamphlets, and books. Each success reinforced the next, building a network of connections that extended beyond Philadelphia to other colonies. By his early 30s, Franklin had transformed himself from an anonymous journeyman into one of the most respected figures in Philadelphia. His print shop thrived, his writings shaped public debate, and his institutions anchored the city's cultural and intellectual life. He had risen not by chance but by deliberate, unrelenting effort, guided by a belief that knowledge and industry could elevate any man who embraced them. The boy who had once arrived on the city's docks, hungry and nearly penniless, had become a symbol of its progress, embodying the ideal that through discipline, learning, and enterprise, a new world could be built from the ground up.
Benjamin Franklin entered a new phase of his life once he had secured his fortune and stepped back from the daily burdens of his business. Freed from the constant demands of printing schedules and financial concerns, he turned his restless energy toward the world of ideas. His curiosity, once confined to stolen hours late at night, now became the central force of his existence. He transformed his home into a laboratory, cluttered with glass jars, metal rods, Leyden jars, and all manner of improvised apparatus. He approached experimentation with the same discipline that had once defined his rise in commerce, recording each observation meticulously and repeating trials until results were consistent. Electricity fascinated him most of all. He sensed in its strange sparks and silent discharges a hidden order of nature waiting to be uncovered, and he pursued this mystery with relentless determination. Franklin's experiments with electrical charges were daring for his time. He studied how electricity could travel through metal conductors, how it leapt from point to point, and how it could be stored. He invented new instruments to measure its behavior, devising clever ways to demonstrate invisible forces to astonished onlookers. He began to suspect that the lightning that flashed across the sky might be the same force he coaxed from his jars and wires. To test this, he devised his famous kite experiment, launching a silk kite into a stormy sky while he stood below, sheltered in a doorway, holding a key tied to the string. When the wet cord drew down electric charges from the storm clouds, he felt the faint shocks through the key and saw sparks jump from his knuckle. It was a moment of revelation. The terrifying power that had struck churches and shattered trees was not divine wrath, but a natural force, governed by the same laws that ruled his small laboratory. This discovery elevated him instantly to the ranks of the world's leading natural philosophers, and news of it spread rapidly through Europe and the colonies. His mind, however, never confined itself to one discipline. Franklin applied his inventive spirit to practical problems that plagued daily life. He devised the Franklin stove, an efficient heating device that provided warmth with less fuel, and designed bifocal spectacles to spare himself the nuisance of switching between pairs of glasses. He refined the design of lightning rods, offering buildings protection from the destructive forces he had studied. These innovations reflected his belief that science was not an abstract pursuit, but a tool to improve human existence. He published his findings not in cloistered academic journals, but in widely circulated papers and letters, ensuring that his work reached artisans, farmers, and householders as well as scholars. This accessibility enhanced his reputation as a man whose intellect served the common good, not merely personal acclaim. As Franklin's scientific fame grew, so did his responsibilities in public affairs. The British Crown appointed him postmaster for the North American colonies, a position that demanded not just administrative oversight, but vision and reform. The colonial postal system had been disorganized and unreliable, plagued by delays and confusion. Franklin approached the challenge as an engineer would approach a broken mechanism.
He mapped routes, standardized rates, established regular schedules, and introduced accounting systems that reduced losses and improved efficiency. Within a few years, letters and newspapers traveled with unprecedented speed between distant settlements, knitting together the scattered colonies with lines of communication. This achievement quietly transformed the social and political landscape, allowing ideas, news, and debate to circulate with a speed that had never before been possible. Yet as Franklin's work tied the colonies closer to one another, it also deepened his awareness of their growing estrangement from Britain. He observed how colonial economies flourished through their own industry and ingenuity, yet remained subject to distant governors and arbitrary policies. The taxes and regulations imposed by London struck him as increasingly unjust, designed to enrich the empire at the expense of colonial welfare. He began writing essays and pamphlets that challenged the prevailing order, using the same sharp pen that had once made his newspaper famous. These writings did not yet call outright for rebellion, but they questioned the legitimacy of authority that ignored the consent of the governed. He argued that free societies thrive on participation and responsibility, not subservience. Over time, his private doubts hardened into conviction. The logic of self-government seemed to him an extension of the same rational principles that guided his scientific work. If nature obeyed universal laws, then human society too should follow principles rooted in fairness and reason, not inherited privilege or imperial decree. He corresponded with reformers and philosophers on both sides of the Atlantic, sharpening his arguments and seeking allies. In salons of London and lecture halls of Paris, his name carried the prestige of discovery, and he used that reputation to speak for the colony's grievances. His demeanor remained calm and measured, yet beneath it grew a quiet resolve that the people of America must someday stand on their own. By the time his hair had turned silver, Franklin embodied the power of reason more than any man of his generation. He had shown that disciplined thought could master lightning, warm homes, and connect distant lands with invisible threads of communication. Now he turned that same intellect toward the architecture of liberty, convinced that ideas, once proven, could be as unstoppable as the forces of nature he had unveiled. The boy who had once set type in a dim shop had become a philosopher-statesman, wielding knowledge as a force stronger than wealth or birthright, preparing, perhaps unknowingly, for the storm that would soon break across the continent.
When the first shots of the American Revolution echoed across the colonies, Benjamin Franklin was already an old man by the standards of his time, yet his mind remained as sharp and vigorous as ever. Decades of enterprise, invention, and public service had tempered him into a figure of extraordinary authority, and when the Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia, he stepped into its chambers with the gravity of one who sensed that history itself had reached a turning point. The hall buzzed with tension and uncertainty. The colonies were a patchwork of interests and temperaments, bound together more by shared grievances than by any unified vision. Franklin understood this fractured nature better than most, and he devoted himself to weaving it into cohesion. He counseled patience when tempers flared, offered compromise when factions clashed, and spoke with quiet conviction of the necessity of liberty. His presence alone seemed to calm disputes, and younger delegates often deferred to his judgment even when they disagreed. As debates intensified, the notion of complete separation from Britain, once unthinkable, took root as the only logical course. Franklin watched this evolution with a kind of grim satisfaction, for he had long suspected that reconciliation was impossible. He lent his pen to the drafting of the Declaration of Independence, contributing edits and insights that sharpened its language and gave it force. Though Thomas Jefferson held the primary quill, Franklin's influence permeated the document like a steady current. He ensured that its arguments rested not on passion alone, but on the universal principles he cherished: natural rights, self-determination, and the consent of the governed. When the Congress finally voted for independence in July 1776, Franklin signed the Declaration with deliberate solemnity, fully aware that the act branded him a traitor in the eyes of the Crown. The decision did not thrill him, it sobered him.
He knew the colonies had chosen a perilous path from which there was no return. Even as independence was proclaimed, Franklin recognized that the struggle could not be won by spirit alone. The colonies lacked the resources to stand against the British Empire unaided, and he saw with piercing clarity that survival depended on foreign alliances. France, Britain's ancient rival, offered the most promising prospect, and Franklin volunteered to cross the Atlantic on a mission that would demand all his skill and patience. The voyage itself was grueling, beset by winter storms and the threat of British warships, but he endured it as he had endured every trial of his long life. When he arrived in Paris, he entered a world of glittering salons and rigid hierarchies, utterly unlike the rough-hewn colonies he had left behind. Yet he adapted with uncanny ease. Clad in plain American garments that contrasted sharply with the silks and lace of the French court, he fashioned an image of rustic simplicity that captivated the public imagination. Philosophers hailed him as the embodiment of republican virtue, and aristocrats vied for the honor of hosting him. Beneath this charming exterior, however, Franklin pursued his objective with unrelenting focus. He navigated the labyrinth of French politics with subtlety, cultivating allies among ministers, bankers, and intellectuals while deflecting the intrigues of those who sought to exploit or undermine the American cause. He understood that France hesitated to commit itself openly, fearing the risk of another ruinous war with Britain, and he set out to convince them that the American rebellion could succeed, and that France would benefit from hastening that outcome. He presented carefully chosen reports of colonial victories, exaggerated just enough to inspire confidence, and assured French officials that American resolve would not falter. Simultaneously, he appealed to the ideals of the Enlightenment, portraying the struggle not as a mere quarrel over taxes, but as a global contest between liberty and tyranny. Franklin's charm became as powerful a weapon as any musket. Crowds gathered outside his residence to glimpse the venerable philosopher who had tamed lightning and now sought to tame empires. His portraits appeared in shop windows and on snuff boxes. Poets composed verses in his honor. This celebrity status gave him leverage at court, where popularity carried political weight. In private meetings with Foreign Minister Vergennes, Franklin remained patient, courteous, and immovable, gently pressing the case for open alliance while never appearing desperate. Over time, the balance of European power shifted in his favor. British blunders on the battlefield made American victory seem less improbable, and French resentment of Britain's global dominance rekindled. Franklin sensed the change and struck decisively. In 1778, he secured a formal treaty of alliance between France and the United States, bringing French troops, naval forces, and financial aid into the war. The impact was immediate and profound. French fleets challenged British control of the seas, French armies landed on American soil, and French gold flowed into colonial coffers. What had once seemed a doomed rebellion transformed into a formidable war effort. Franklin had accomplished what many had deemed impossible. He had turned the might of Europe against the British Empire on behalf of a fledgling republic. The victory at Yorktown a few years later owed as much to French arms as to American valor, and every musket fired there carried an echo of Franklin's patient diplomacy. While the fighting continued, Franklin's own life in France settled into a strange duality. By day, he drafted treaties, managed loans, and corresponded with Congress across the ocean. By evening, he attended salons where he discussed philosophy, science, and the future of mankind with the luminaries of Europe. Yet even in moments of triumph, he remained clear-eyed about the fragility of what he was building. He knew alliances were born of interest, not sentiment, and that today's allies could be tomorrow's rivals. His task was not merely to win a war, but to secure a peace that would allow the new nation to stand on its own. When his mission finally ended and he prepared to return to America, Franklin was no longer merely a colonial printer, or even a renowned scientist. He had become a statesman of global stature, revered as the architect who had helped design not just the foundations of American independence, but its place among the nations of the world. As his ship departed from the French coast, the crowds that had once cheered him faded into the mist, yet their applause lingered in the corridors of power. He carried home with him the knowledge that the experiment in liberty he had championed now had a future, and that his patient, subtle labor had given birth to a nation.
When the thunder of cannons had at last faded and the United States stood recognized as an independent nation, Benjamin Franklin returned from his years in Europe to find a country both triumphant and fragile. The Revolution had secured liberty, but it had not yet secured unity. The 13 states were bound by a loose confederation that often seemed on the verge of dissolving, each jealous of its own sovereignty, each wary of central authority. Franklin, old and weary from decades of service, might have chosen to withdraw from public life. Instead, he resolved to dedicate his remaining strength to shaping the political framework that would hold the fledgling republic together. He understood that victory on the battlefield would mean little without a durable system of government to preserve it. In 1787, delegates from across the states gathered in Philadelphia to draft a new constitution, and Franklin, at 81, was among them. Age had stooped his frame and weakened his voice, yet his presence carried immense weight. He moved slowly, supported by a cane, but his mind remained quick, and his reputation as the elder sage of the Revolution lent him a unique authority. The convention was riven with disputes from its earliest days. Large states demanded representation by population, while small states feared being swallowed by their more populous neighbors. Southern delegates sought protections for the institution of slavery, while others spoke against it in moral outrage. There were arguments over the powers of the executive, the shape of the legislature, the independence of the judiciary, and the delicate balance between state and federal authority. Voices rose, tempers flared, and more than once it seemed the convention would collapse into failure. Franklin did not dominate these debates with force or rhetoric. He guided them with patience and subtlety. He rarely gave long speeches, for he knew that his frail health made oratory difficult. But when he spoke, the hall grew quiet. He urged the delegates to set aside pride and personal ambition for the sake of the common good, reminding them that the eyes of the world were upon them and that posterity would judge their actions. He proposed compromises that preserved the dignity of all sides while moving the work forward. Though he had little taste for rigid doctrines, he favored a strong yet limited federal government, one capable of binding the states together without extinguishing their individuality. His suggestions helped shape key provisions of the new Constitution, including the creation of a bicameral legislature and the checks and balances between branches of government. At the same time, Franklin used the convention as a platform to speak against the practice of slavery, which he regarded as incompatible with the principles for which the Revolution had been fought. Though he had once owned slaves in his younger years, he had long since renounced the institution and become an active abolitionist. He served as president of the Pennsylvania Society for promoting the abolition of slavery, and even as he labored to craft a new national framework, he drafted petitions calling on Congress to end the slave trade and lay plans for gradual emancipation. These efforts met fierce resistance from Southern delegates who regarded slavery as essential to their economies, and Franklin knew that his appeals would not succeed in his lifetime. Yet he pressed them anyway, believing that the moral foundation of the Republic could not rest on human bondage. His opposition did not carry the convention, but it planted seeds that would later grow into the struggle for abolition. Despite his failing health, Franklin remained deeply engaged in the civic life of Philadelphia throughout these years. His house became a gathering place for politicians, scientists, philosophers, and reformers who came to seek his counsel or simply to bask in his presence. He encouraged the spread of public education, libraries, and scientific societies, convinced that an enlightened citizenry was essential to the survival of Republican government. He wrote essays and letters advocating for civic virtue, tolerance, and rational discourse, warning that the new nation could only endure if its people placed the common welfare above private ambition. He saw knowledge as the surest safeguard of liberty and tirelessly promoted its diffusion among all classes of society.
When the Constitutional Convention finally completed its work, Franklin affixed his signature with trembling hand to the document that would become the supreme law of the land. In the final session, he remarked that while the Constitution was not perfect, he doubted that any assembly could produce a better one, and he pledged his support to it as the best hope for preserving the fragile Union. The delegates, who had often clashed bitterly with one another, rose to applaud him, not merely out of respect for his age, but out of recognition that his steady guidance had made their achievement possible. The Constitution then went to the states for ratification, and Franklin watched from his home as the nation debated its fate. He lived to see it adopted and to witness the birth of the government it created. In the last months of his life, Franklin remained active in public affairs, even as illness confined him to his bed. He continued to write against slavery, submitting one final petition to Congress calling for its abolition, a plea that provoked angry denunciations from Southern legislators but marked a fitting capstone to his long career of moral and civic endeavor. Visitors still came to his bedside, seeking advice or simply to honor him, and he received them with the same wit and courtesy he had always shown. He looked upon the rising republic with a mixture of pride and caution, knowing how precarious its experiment in self-government remained, yet confident that reason and virtue could sustain it if its people remained vigilant. By the time he withdrew from public life entirely, Benjamin Franklin had lived to see the colonies he had once served as a humble printer transformed into a nation with a constitution, a government, and a future. He had helped design its political structure, championed its principles, and warned of its perils. He stood at the cradle of the Republic not as a conqueror or ruler, but its last great servant, offering the wisdom of a lifetime to ensure its survival. Though his body was frail and his days few, his mind remained fixed on the enduring experiment he had helped set in motion, and he took solace in the thought that its fate now rested in the hands of generations yet to come.
Benjamin Franklin's death in 1790 marked the end of an extraordinary life, but the beginning of a legacy that seemed to transcend mortality. His passing in Philadelphia was mourned not only by the citizens of the young republic, but also by leaders and thinkers across Europe who recognized the breadth of his contributions. Newspapers printed long obituaries recounting his achievements in science, diplomacy, and public service. And his funeral drew a massive crowd, a silent procession of thousands who had never spoken to him, yet felt as though they had known him through the ideas he had shared with the world. His name became a symbol of enlightened citizenship, the embodiment of a man who had managed to unite practicality with the ideals of humanism and the relentless pursuit of knowledge. In the years following his death, Franklin's writings began to circulate more widely than ever before. His autobiography, unfinished yet vivid, became a manual for personal improvement, teaching readers the values of industry, frugality, curiosity, and civic responsibility. Young men and women in the United States read his words as if they were personal instructions from a kindly mentor who had proven by example that humble beginnings need not limit human ambition. His Poor Richard's Almanac, once a source of witty aphorisms and advice, was reprinted and quoted endlessly, its simple wisdom becoming woven into the fabric of American thought. The maxims he had crafted as a printer and publisher continued to live in the spoken language of the people, shaping the character of a nation still unsure of its identity. His scientific works also endured, reminding future generations that Franklin had been as devoted to understanding the natural world as he was to improving human society. His experiments with electricity, especially the famous kite experiment, were recounted in textbooks and scientific journals, celebrated as daring acts of curiosity that had helped unravel the mysteries of nature. His inventions, the lightning rod, the bifocal glasses, the Franklin stove, remained in use, quiet witnesses to his ingenuity and his belief that knowledge should serve practical ends. These creations were not preserved merely as relics, but as living tools, reminders that intellect found its noblest purpose in alleviating human hardship and increasing comfort and safety. Politically, his influence did not fade with his passing. The Constitution he had helped shape became the foundation of the American Republic, and many of the compromises he had supported endured as guiding principles. Though he had not been its primary author, his presence at the Constitutional Convention had helped bring disparate voices together, and his spirit of pragmatism continued to echo in the halls of government. Lawmakers often cited his example as proof that wisdom could emerge from experience rather than privilege, and that public service required humility as well as ambition. His open opposition to slavery, expressed in his final years, became a moral beacon for later generations of reformers who saw in him a forerunner of their own struggles for justice. Franklin's influence stretched beyond America's borders. In France, where he had once been received as a hero of liberty, his image persisted in paintings, statues, and the memories of those who had witnessed his charm and intellect firsthand. European intellectuals celebrated him as a man who embodied the Enlightenment, a living proof that reason and virtue could guide the creation of new society. His correspondence with philosophers, scientists, and statesmen remained preserved in archives, studied as evidence of a mind that had bridged continents and disciplines with effortless grace. In the salons of Paris and the lecture halls of London, his name was invoked as a symbol of possibility, of what humanity could achieve when freed from the chains of dogma and fear. Within America, Franklin's legacy became deeply entwined with the idea of the self-made man. Generations of schoolchildren were taught his life story as a parable of perseverance, the tale of a printer's apprentice who had risen to become a statesman and a sage. His virtues were held up as models for citizenship in a republic that depended on the integrity and initiative of its people. Communities named streets, schools, and towns after him, as though hoping that some fragment of his spirit might linger in the places that bore his name. His face eventually appeared on currency, an enduring reminder of his role not merely as a founder of a nation, but as an architect of its character. Even as the centuries advanced and America changed in ways Franklin could not have imagined, his presence endured like a faint but steady light. Historians debated his beliefs, scholars dissected his writings, and critics questioned his compromises, yet none could deny the magnitude of his impact. He remained a figure both accessible and elusive, his genial wit masking a relentless discipline, his public geniality concealing a restless drive to improve the human condition. He was remembered not for seeking power, but for seeking understanding, not for commanding armies, but for commanding ideas. That distinction, rare in any age, became the essence of his immortality. Franklin's life stood as proof that greatness need not be born from privilege or conquest, but could be forged from curiosity, persistence, and the will to serve something larger than oneself. He had believed that knowledge was a public good, and that the pursuit of it ennobled both the seeker and the society that nurtured him. This belief became his most enduring gift, inspiring generations to strive not only for personal advancement, but for the elevation of all. In the echoes of his words and the quiet presence of his inventions, in the institutions he helped build and the ideals he championed, Benjamin Franklin's spirit continued to walk beside the nation he had helped to create. His shadow lay across the centuries, not as a burden, but as a compass. It reminded those who followed that true greatness was not measured in titles or monuments, but in the lasting good one left behind. Franklin had departed, but the light he carried did not dim. It scattered like countless sparks across time, igniting minds, kindling hope, and whispering that the power of reason, joined with the will to serve, could yet illuminate the world.